All right, so now we can move to perfect competition. And perfect competition is something like a light build, which is like some kind of a mission that guides a lot of economic policy. So perfect competition is a concept that has many favorable dynamics. And so let's take a look into these. So let's first take a look into the assumptions of a perfectly competitive firm. So in perfect competition, we assume that there are many people on the demand side and the supply side, and essentially so many people that no one has any market power. We also assume that we have perfect information. Everyone knows the same thing. There are no transaction costs. That means if I want to find out whether eggs are more cheap on one market than the other, that is available at a zero cost. The only costs occur in terms of the production of the good, but there are no information generation costs. There's also free entry and exit, and as a result, no firm has any market power. And we say that firms are price takers. So that means that if there is a price in the market, let's say there's a price for a cookie, and the price of a cookie is $1, then if a small firm enters the market and produces more cookies, then that doesn't mean that the price will go down. So normally we will say, if there is an increase in supply, then price will go down, but the firm is so small that it will not affect the market price. So firms that want to enter the market, they are so small that when the price for a cookie is $1, they have to charge $1. If they charged more, nobody would buy from them because they could go across the street, the consumers could go across the street and buy it for $1 somewhere else. If you try to sell a cookie for less than $1, then you would get so much demand that you couldn't serve the demand, and you would be forced to increase the price back to $1. So that's a little bit the idea of being a price taker. In a perfectly competitive world, no firm can charge a higher price because then nobody will buy from them. No firm can also charge a lower price because they couldn't serve then the market. And that can also be summarized under, we have an atomistic market structure. And of course, we all assume, we assume that all countries produce the same homogeneous good. So all the cookies are the same. And last but not least, we have a behavioral assumption, which means that the firm maximizes profit. So let's quickly talk about profit maximization. So profit, which is often abbreviated by the Greek letter pi, is equal to total revenue minus total cost. So now we said that for a typical firm, the price is a given. Everyone is a price taker. So that means if a typical firm increases its quantity, then the total revenue is equal to a given price, like $1 for a cookie, times the quantity. So P bar means it's a fixed price. So that is essentially a straight line. So the total revenue is a straight line. And we also need to take a look into total cost. And let's say total cost is, let's make that maybe orange here. So total cost. We said the typical total cost function looks like this. So cost first increases, so roughly like this. So total cost first increase at a diminishing rate, and then after some point of inflection, it increases at an increasing rate. So we already know the total cost function. So now we can create another graph, and we just subtract total revenue. We just subtract from total revenue total cost, and then we can display the profit. Okay, and then we can see initially we make a loss because if we produce very small amounts, the total cost exceeds total revenue. So here's a point where we break even. So our profit function, let's make that, I don't know, green. So initially we make a loss, but then that loss narrows down, and then we break even, and then there is a certain range of production where we make a profit. Well, so now the challenge is, of course, to find the maximum profit, which is in the profit function, the point where the slope is 0, because that then is a maximum. So what we need to do is we need to take mathematically, in order to maximize profit, we have to take the derivative of the profit function with respect to the quantity and set that equal to 0. So that means if we take the derivative of the profit function, then we basically get, because total revenue is a function of Q, so we can write the change in total revenue with respect to Q is the change in total revenue, which is a function of Q with respect to Q, minus the derivative of total cost with respect to Q, that needs to be equal to 0. Well, as you can tell already, this here is the marginal revenue, and the second term is the marginal cost. So now we know, in order for that first order condition to apply, what must happen is that marginal revenue has to be equal to marginal cost. So that is the profit maximizing condition for a typical firm. In other words, a firm will expand production as long as the extra revenue that the firm gets is greater than the extra cost that the production of that extra unit costs. So, and we already know that the marginal cost function looks like this. So the marginal cost function looks like this. So we have derived that earlier. So okay, so the marginal cost looks like so that's the marginal cost. And what about the marginal revenue? Well, the total revenue is P bar, a fixed price, times Q. So therefore, it follows that the marginal revenue, which is the total revenue derived with respect to Q, that is simply P bar. So the marginal revenue is then a horizontal line, marginal revenue, which is simply P bar. So that means here where the price intersects with the marginal cost function, that's the profit maximizing quantity, or Q star. So that is the idea. So the point here is that profit maximization requires that the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, so now let's take a look a little bit into more detail. And let's make that quickly a little bit smaller. Okay, so here we have a market. And in this market we have millions and gazillions of consumers and producers. And again, the consumers are lined up from highest willingness to pay to the lowest. So every point here is essentially a consumer. And in fact, every dot can be 1,000 consumers. And every point on the supply function is a small firm. And they are lined up from lowest to highest reservation price. So now the market clears at, let's say, a price of 7, and let's just say a total quantity of 700. So that's just a numerical example. So that is where the market clears. So now here we have the cost function, the short run cost function of a typical firm. So the price of 7 that prevails in that market is a given for the typical firm. So the price of 7 is equal to the marginal revenue. So the typical firm knows if I want to sell another good, I will get 7. That's my marginal revenue. So this is equal to the marginal revenue, and we already know the marginal cost. So this is the marginal cost function. The red one. So at this point, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So now we know that the profit maximizing quantity for a typical firm is 7. Well, if a typical firm produces 7, then we know that in the market there must be a total of 700 over 7, 100 firms. So in this market here, we have 100 firms. So technically I should have, drawn here 100 dots. And every firm is producing 7 in the optimum. Okay, but there is now more to it, because this is the short run. Why is it the short run? Well, it is the short run because in the short run, they make a profit. So the price is equal to the marginal revenue, but that is also equal to the average revenue. So let's review again. We said the total revenue is some fixed price times quantity. So then the marginal revenue is the first derivative of the total revenue with respect to the quantity, and then we get P. Well, and the average revenue, call that AR, is total revenue divided by Q, which is also P. So that means in this example, this distance here between 7 and 5, this distance is the average profit. Well, and since this average profit occurs 7 times, the total profit is this green box. And this total profit is 7 times the average profit, which is 7 times 2, which is 14. So there is now a total profit of 14. So what does this mean? In economics, we call this kind of profit supernormal profit. Supernormal profit, supernormal profit. And supernormal profit means that is equal to total revenue minus the direct cost or out-of-pocket expenditures like raw materials and rent and wages and those kind of things. So minus direct cost, but it also includes all economic or indirect cost. So that means, so supernormal profit is total revenue minus direct cost minus indirect costs. And indirect costs are like foregone opportunities, like if I have a little store and this is like a little factory or a little shop and I work there, that means I don't work somewhere else as an employee, so I forego that income. But that is also all factored in. So in other words, supernormal profit means you make more profit than what you will get if you realized all next best alternatives. So why do I have this firm? Well, because if I worked somewhere else, I wouldn't make as much profit as I do by making this firm. So supernormal profit is a profit that exceeds the profit associated with all next best alternatives, including like foregone interest on your capital expenditures, foregone income and wages if you worked somewhere else. So those kind of things. So this green area is what we call supernormal profit. Okay. So supernormal profit is this green area here. So let's move next to what happens in the long run. So what is important is that this firm and every typical firm, they make a supernormal profit. So the way you can think about it is that you have identified a new business opportunity which is so successful that you make really a huge profit. Well, what happens is that this huge profit attracts market entry. So now we have market entry. Let me just quickly. Okay, so this gray was our original supply function, so it was like those blue dots. But now what happened is that as a result of the supernormal profits that the firms make, what happens is that this supply function shifts now to the right because of many new firms entering the market. And when we talked about the determinants of supply, you remember that more competition is a determinant of a shift of supply. So what happens is that this supernormal profit attracts a lot of market entry, and a lot of market entry, it's not just one additional firm. One firm would make a difference, but like think of it of thousands, they enter now the market. And of course, as the supply shifts to the right, what happens is that the market equilibrium price comes down. So we shift here, supply to the right, and the original equilibrium price from 7 falls now to 4. So that is the new price. So price comes down, and of course that's good for the consumers. But now what happens is that if the price comes down, that means also for a typical firm, the quantity supplied in the profit maximizing condition, which is price equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost, is now going down as well. So what happens is that when we look at the new equilibrium, where the marginal cost function intersects with the marginal revenue function, we have now a new profit maximizing condition, which is this green dot, and which is a quantity of 5. So now if we have 900 firms, but in the long run equilibrium, each firm only supplies now 5, that means we must have 900 over 5, or 180 firms in the market. So now we have 180 firms in the market, and each firm produces only 5. But now what happens is this equilibrium. So what you can see is that in the long run, all firms, they operate at the minimum of average total cost. So in the long run, all firms operate at ATC min. So in the long run, all firms operate at ATC min. And that means that in the long run, all supernormal profits are gone. Supernormal profits are gone. Or we say supernormal profits are 0, or economic profits are 0. So this is now interesting from 2 perspectives. First, what we know is that under the assumptions of perfect competition, we always have allocation efficiency. So we always have allocation efficiency. And allocation efficiency means that the price is equal to the marginal cost. And we have that both in the short run and in the long run. Because each firm, so the price, each firm will always choose the quantity where price equals marginal cost. If the price were above marginal cost, well, that would mean that we don't have allocation efficiency, because if the price were, let's say, for a good 7, but it only costs to produce another unit of 4, well, then it would be efficient if that extra unit would be produced, because it will create welfare. So whenever the price is greater than marginal cost, we prevent mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. But when price equals marginal cost, there is no more room for mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges. So that's the idea of allocation efficiency. So when the price equals marginal cost, all opportunities for mutually beneficial exchanges are exhausted. The second thing that we can see is we have, in the long run at least, in the long run, we also have what we call production efficiency. So production efficiency means that each firm operates at the minimum of average total cost. So that means existing resources that are that you can find in, let's say, factories, they are utilized in the best way. All the machines, they run so efficiently that all the machines operate with the least average total cost possible. And of course, that is, in the long run, that average total cost function will be the one from the most efficient one from the long run cost function, what we talked about earlier. So in the long run, all firms that enter the market, they will choose the best plant size, which is this blue average total cost function. So we have two things. We always have, in the short run and in the long run, we always have allocation efficiency. Well, in the short run, we don't have production efficiency because technically what happens is we produce to the right of the minimum of ATC. And the way you can think of it is that market is booming so much that, you know, all the machines, they run at the speed which is much higher than what is the optimum. But it allows for that supernormal profit. But then we have market entry, supply shifts to the right, and all the firms are in the long run forced to produce at the minimum of average total cost. And again, if in the long run all the firms produce 5 units and the market equilibrium is, for example, 900, that means we must have now 180 firms. And you can see how the transition from the short run to the long run especially benefits the consumers, because initially we have maybe here consumer surplus, which is 700 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is 3,500. So consumer surplus is maybe 1,750. And also producer surplus is 1,750. So welfare is 3,500. But in the long run, we have here 900 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So total surplus will go up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7,200. So that will be the new consumer surplus. And in the long run, so you can see how the consumers, they benefit, because we will have now 7,200, for example, in consumer surplus, and of course also producer surplus. That actually in the long run turns out it will be actually technically zero. But the point is, let's just focus on consumer surplus, and you can see how competition benefits the consumers. We will talk about producer surplus and the long run aggregate supply function later, but as I already spelled it out currently, the long run aggregate supply function in the long run is a horizontal line. So that would be the long run aggregate supply function. And then there will be zero producer surplus. But we will talk about that later as we go through a numerical example. This is just the intuition for now. Okay, so let's just summarize again a little bit, and let's okay, so now we can say, if you look at the supply function, you know, we always drew a supply function earlier as an upward sloping line. So what is the supply function? We typically drew the supply function as a straight line. Well, it actually turns out that the supply function is the marginal cost function. So if you remember, the marginal cost function looks like this. It's like U-shaped. And then we had our two. We had average total cost and average variable cost. Technically, the supply function is the section of the marginal cost function above the average variable cost function. So that means the price must be at least as high so that it covers the average variable cost. And you remember we said the price equals marginal revenue equals average revenue. So if the average revenue at least covers the average variable cost, that means you cover at least your operational expenses. And even if you still make a loss and you don't cover part of the average total cost, at least you can cover some of the average total cost and you stay in the market. So the supply function in microeconomic terms is the marginal cost function after the minimum of average variable cost. Because only then it makes sense for a firm to stay in the market. So the supply function starts in economic terms here. That is the supply function. It's the marginal cost function above the average variable cost. Because if the price is at least covering my average variable cost, then I can cover for my operational expenses like wages and everything, and I cover some of my fixed cost. But if the price fell below the minimum of average variable cost, and you don't make enough money to, let's say, to even pay your workers, well, then you would have to shut down. So that's why the minimum of average variable cost is also known as the shutdown price. Okay, so now we know where the marginal, how the marginal cost function is the supply function. So why, again, if the price, which is equal to the average revenue, is greater than average total cost, well then we would make a supernormal profit. So that would be up here. If the price were here, then this would be our profit maximizing quantity, and you can see we make an average profit and we get the supernormal profit. If the price equals the average total cost, we make zero economic profits and the market is in the long run. And if the price is less than average total cost, the firm makes a loss. So if it's between those, the green and the blue one, so if the price is less than average total cost, we do not cover all fixed costs, but the firm still makes an operational profit and will stay in the market until all the capital is depreciated. Okay. And ultimately what that will do is it will minimize your losses. And if the price falls below average variable cost, as I just said, then you do not even cover the operational expenses and the firm needs to shut down, which is what we call the minimum of average variable cost, also the shutdown price. Okay, so why do economists love perfect competition? Well, economics is about the efficiency and the use of scarce resources. And perfect competition allocates scarce resources most efficiently. And specifically, both in the short run and in the long run, the price equals to marginal cost. That is what we call allocation efficiency. All possible opportunities for mutually beneficial exchanges, they are exhausted. So since the market price reflects marginal utility and supply marginal cost, perfect competition assures that no buyer is left in the market whose willingness to pay exceeds any seller's reservation price. That is allocation efficiency. Price equals marginal cost. So all voluntary win-win situations between buyers and sellers are then exhausted. Additionally, but only in the long run, in the model of perfect competition, all firms operate at the average total cost minimum, and that is what we call production efficiency. So all firms operate with the optimum plant size, and each plant size is utilized optimally. And it just cannot get any more efficient than that. If you remember, we said economics is essentially the science of allocating scarce resources efficiently. Well, in perfect competition, it cannot get any more effective or more efficient than this. And so let's stop here. And then in the next video, we turn a little bit to the villain of economics, which is the monopolist. And there we will see now why that is less beneficial than perfect competition.